morning and welcome back to the lecture series on partition of India in print media and cinema. So, today we are going to talk about caste politics in Punjab partition as well as discuss the micro societies and their natures and how subcultures actually form, how they evolve and how they interact with mainstream cultural expressions. So, or how the subcultures interact with and develop through interaction with the mainstream cultural expressions and mainstream socio-cultural processes. So, within the master narrative of partition migration history, we see that the experiences of the untouchables have not so much been mentioned, they have remained obscured until a long time. So, this also pertains, this is also true in the case of Punjab partitions. This also holds true in the case, of Punjab partition. So, space and region are some of the factors that determine the development of refugees and their journey from being refugee to becoming the citizen. And so, we have to understand that the process of migration was never homogeneous. It had, depending on a person's caste, class, social background, different policies were actually devised by the government to resettle the refugees. So, we see, for example, that in Delhi, Regarpura is relatively a prosperous area compared to other untouchable colonies in the east and northern parts, and because of its proximity to the commercial activities in Karol Bagh, we see the tanning and shoe manufacturing businesses. We see the tanning and shoe manufacturing as booming cottage industries in these areas. So, having proximity with areas that are known for commercial activities had their own benefit. Regarpura is a case in hand. So, government policies of settlement separated the upper castes from the untouchables between 1947 and 1965. So, the process of population exchange was greatly determined depending on the refugees' socio-economic background, like I already stated. So, when we understand a partition only in terms of a homogeneous community, that's a flawed understanding of the situation. When we try to grasp the episode of human migration across the border in terms of the individual's communal identity, there is a kind of misconstruation or false understanding formed. So, we have to understand the omissions, the gaps in the partition history, and thereby we need to question the simplified and compressed version, and instead need to probe into the multi-layered nuanced personal experiences that are informed by various or that are informed by diverse experiences of the migrants. So, in Western India we see that two stock narratives or two kind of stereotypical narratives, two meta narratives in a way get circulated a lot. They are prevalent at the heart of the mainstream. One is the rhetoric of loss, how much people lost, and then the process of restoration of this loss through the dint of one's hard work, merit, and through social networking, through political connections and so on. So, in this process of narrating one's loss, like Ravinder Kaur says, and something that I am going to discuss more in detail when I talk about the refugees, the situation of the refugees in subsequent lectures. I mean, the story, the narration of loss by the wealthier sections actually emphasize it, and they underline their affluent status, what they used to possess, their aristocratic background. So, when there are stories regarding someone that had to leave their valuables, their jewelry and family heirlooms back in their homestead, in their ancestral home on the other side of the border, there is also an assertion that these people used to be from the richest part or the most affluent section of the society, and from there on the story of rebuilding, of refurbishing what had been razed by partition also subscribes to their human qualities such as merit, capability to work hard and honestly, and so these become family stories that run down generations. So they run through from one generation to the other regarding how a refugee had resettled and reestablished himself in the new land, in the host land, and how they had made themselves visible and prominent through their service in the new nation state, in the post-colonial new nation state that was formed. So, so there are stories of people establishing their homes, their businesses flourishing, and then they are locating themselves among powerful lobbies in local Delhi politics. So, these are stories that are frequently circulated among the Punjabi refugees, and the case of Bengal is not very different from this. Gyanendra Pandey would say that widespread meta-discourse of communal violence is actually rooted to the British colonial interpretation of the two communities. How the British, so it was the British that had set the lens for Hindus to see the Muslims and vice versa. So the Hindus would be largely seen, Hindu males would largely be seen as effeminate and not very strong, and on a positive side they would be seen as more tolerant, whereas the Muslims were stereotyped as aggressive and tyrants and betrayers and so forth. So this was at the root of identity making in differential identity making in colonial India, and so the knowledge of partition, the prevalent knowledge, the common knowledge that we all have about partition actually flows from the upper echelons, upper middle class and middle class, upper caste protagonists, and their experiences are actually etched in the major works, the seminal works on partition. So, in the form of memoirs, autobiographies and biographies, newspaper reports and public speech, what we can access, what is most easily accessible to the public is the elitist discourse on partition. So, we need to understand this, and something that we are going to repeat again in our subsequent lecture is the quintessential figure of the refugee subject. This refugee subject certainly has a class, caste and gender belonging. So, the refugee that can speak, that speaks for himself as well as for others. So, the protagonists in most of the artworks and fictions, in fictions as well as non-fictions, and these, this privileged section of migrants go on to construct the master narratives about master narratives of partition. So, for example, we see in Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, there are frequent references to moneylenders, to landed peasants, businessmen, to soldiers, clerks, and all of them belong to the influential upper strata of the society. So, we understand that partition as a mass produced event is authenticated and validated when it comes through the mouthpiece, when it is narrated through the mouthpiece of the elite. The narrator is mostly belonging to a privileged section who talks about himself. So, in each of these stories, we see the protagonist, the lead character, as someone who has some social and economic capital, and the people that are being rampantly killed and their property being destroyed are generally an anonymous crowd in the background. So, they make up the backdrop of the central narrative. There are certainly some exceptions that talk about that narrate the account of the landless peasant. And there have been many artworks written by upper caste, middle class, refined class authors both in Punjab and in Bengal that try to frame the narrative from the vantage point of the Dalit, but such cases are not rife. So, Tamas is an example where we see that though the Dalit Sikh tanner is actually the Dalit Sikh tanner is relegated to the background, the entire narrative almost spins around him. The narrative is centered on him and his perspective, and his wife's perspective. So, we see that in Tamas, the riots have been instigated and provoked by upper caste people, upper class people that are, by the way, very good friends among them. So, the businessmen, upper class Muslims and Hindus actually cohabit peacefully. Their relationship mutually benefit each other. Their relationship is symbiotic, but this is not the same for the Dalits, for the landless and the subaltern, right. So, what is interesting in Tamas is that the ones that started the riot do not so much feel guilty, but the Dalit man that has been used as the pawn actually carries the weight of guilt throughout the narrative. And when we talk of subalterns, we cannot not talk about the women from all the sections. So, the colonizer's wife, the Dalit man's wife, the Hindu businessman's wife, and we see, and the Sikh man's wife. So, we have all these women that are not functioning from the pith or the core of politics. Their political consciousness is supposed to be not very strong, and yet they actually they display a kind of sensibility which is astounding, which perplexes the patriarchal connivance that supports war and war violence and bloodshed. So, we see women asking some very fundamental questions that unnerve and disquiet the roots of patriarchy, something that the patriarchal assumptions that naturalize, normalize, and in fact support, defend the war schemings, right. So, so we see that Dalits, subalterns, females, they are relegated to the backdrop as an anonymous mass. So, major partition narratives have it that the Dalits, for example, there is this common perception that in the northwestern frontier during the partition, the Dalits had to espouse Islam out of expediency. Many Dalits were forced to embrace Islam, and that and this kind of stock narrative actually awaits. I mean, this narrative suggests that so these stock narratives suggest that the Dalit converts awaited, desperately awaited the Hindu and the Sikh upper castes to come rescue them and bring them back into the fold of their original religion, and rescue them from the loathsome idea that the loathsome Islamic occupation and that went on to become Pakistan, the loathsome idea of Pakistan. So, in the same way, we see that in Pakistan's meta narratives, there are hardly mentions of the other types of leaders that helped the non-Muslims evacuate safely, and also protagonists that wanted the non-Muslims to actually stay back and vouched for their safety. So, in reality, we would see that the picture is much more motleyed, much more diverse and layered and nuanced. So, there were roles of liaisons. There were Muslims, there were Muslim officers that evacuated the non-Muslims, and Hindus that helped, that ensured that the Muslims actually crossed the border safely. But these narratives do not get mentioned so much in the popular accounts and discourse. So, so we understand that just like in the case of Bengal, in Punjab also, the Dalits did not leave their violence prone areas until the end, before the actual partition precipitated, before the cataclysm actually materialized. So, they were still clinging on to their hopes that the partition might not take place. So, their migration, the untouchables migration, happened at the tail end of the population exchange. So, however, we see that unlike in Bengal, where refugees have trickled across several decades against the historical backdrop of different events, against communal riots being provoked at different junctures of history. In the case of Punjab, on the western side, Dalit refugees migration was a neater process, and unlike in the eastern side, where the government did not play a very important or significant role as a beneficiary. In fact, there are many accounts by the Dalits coming up recently that the governments actually exploited their the different governments by different political parties in West Bengal actually exploited the Dalits for their votes. So, they were treated as vote banks. Unlike such a situation in Punjab, we see that the government actually mediated and facilitated resettlement in a great way. So, and a lot of, while the upper castes boast self rehabilitation on both sides of the border, on the western side, Congress actually went on to play a vital role, a major role in designing resettlement policies to the socially and economically disadvantaged sections, and there were many plans and policies designed to uplift and develop the to develop the Dalits conditions. So, and we see that this is a general case, that because the Dalits had Dalits could not Dalits could not claim that they had lost much. They did not have a lot of material property in the first place. Most of them would earn through working in lands. They were not so much entitled to compensation as they were to free doles and the charity acts of the different governments. So, the charities and doles and welfareist schemes of the government helped the Dalits a lot. So, their spaces consequently we see that the Dalits are not choosers of the lands and spaces where they would settle. They were given lands and spaces, and those were not the best of the lands. Those were not they were not resettled in the posh areas or the urban areas. So in many cases they were planned townships or even resettlements done in the suburban areas. And so these people were for some time helpless, because they only had the traditional knowledge or knowledge they had historically earned through traditional occupations. So, they had very limited skills, and after the partition they greatly depended on the government's schemes and services. In the case of Bengal, we see that the agriculturalists, the peasants who worked on lands do not fit well into factory jobs, and there is a lot of dissatisfaction. So, a person with knowledge of peasantry, of tilling lands or fishery or the boatmen would not be grafted very well or repositioned very well in factory jobs. So, Pippa Virdi looks at the Lyalpur district in her research, and how one of the largest populations of non-Muslim refugees had evacuated from West Punjab, the Lyalpur district. So, she describes how the majority travelled on food convoys. So, the mode, the mode of travelling would also define the class and social allocation of the refugee, while the poorer sections would obviously travel on foot for miles, on foot convoys. When we talk of partition, we have the kind of stock image and impression of the kafilas. So, poor people walking on foot, carrying their cattle and belongings on bullock carts and so on, and there are trains or chains of such carts travelling together. So, most of the evacuation in Western Punjab region had taken place by 15th of November, and the scheduled caste population that had stayed back were cleared by the end of November 1947. So, even in refugee camps we see the class caste differentiations being reasserted and maintained. So, the professional groups such as the doctors, professors, lawyers, engineers, journalists, government employees and officials had already lost in many cases had already lost their economic footing, their social reputation. So, they were desperately clinging on to some imagined reputation through maintaining a distance from the Dalit social groups. So, this was a period of uncertainty, and this what Pippa Virdi says holds absolutely, it makes sense, and it holds true in the case of the Bengalis, the middle class Bengali Bhadralok who had lost everything and they were clinging on to an imagined prestige, and that is where the rhetoric, the story of fall comes from, the fall of the middle class. And yet they do not want to be identified and conflated with the Dalits. So, this desperate attempt to preserve one's identity as a social group was there, it was visible. And there are rich people, contrary to how the poorer populations travelled. The richer could actually afford to buy plane tickets, and plane tickets were being sold on black. So, people were paying for inflated taxi fares, Tonga fares, and they could reach airports somehow. And so the flight attendants and the flight companies were bargaining their tickets. They were selling the tickets at overinflated prices like an auction, and they were benefiting through this, benefiting from this tumultuous situation. So, this became a profitable business for the transporters, and so the wealthy people could invest a lot of money and make sure that the process of travelling and resettlement was a safe and successful one. So, this process was safe, successful, even if it cost a lot of money. So, the wealthier sections, where the wealthier population could be more, they could afford to be more flexible regarding their departure, and so they could the process of exchanging property, selecting land, buying land for one's home and business, and there were the question of choice informed all these processes for the affluent, for the richer sections. So, before they flew to Amritsar, they could actually systematically exchange their property. So, from here we are going to talk about the subalterns and the people that we see as parts of subcultures. From here we are going to talk about subalterns and the micro societies, the subcultures. Mridula Mukherjee argues the subalterns are not able to independently carry out the protests and revolts outside of a godhead or outside of a kind of prominent leadership. And Shahid Amin points to the case of the Gorakhpuri peasants who had misplaced or a kind of let us say upside down, not upside down, a kind of perception of Gandhi that was besides Gandhi himself, and so they could not be and their understanding of Gandhian behavior, Gandhian politics was not controlled by any Congress leadership at the locality. So, their unauthorized struggles that went under the banner of Gandhian movement, but was not quite, had led to the assault on the Chauri Chaura Thana or police station, and this prompted Gandhi to call off the entire campaign. And so, Mridula Mukherjee notes that the subaltern action can go wayward in the absence of or it can go on to take it can take on its own expression, a different expression in the absence of elite leadership. So, what Gandhi is saying and how that is being taken, there is an incommensurable gap between the elite leaders and how their messages or how their sermons reach the remote areas. There is a kind of simulacrum, there is a kind of doubled meaning which can, from where the original, the real can hardly be recovered, right. So, Dipesh Chakraborty in Rethinking Working Class History says that they would, so he is referring to the subalterns, they would bow to their superiors, but would demand a certain behavior on the part of the leaders, patriarchal benevolence, a certain match of sentiment. They would demand that they would demand what they thought of as customarily theirs by right, but within the encompassing hierarchical culture, unquote. So, what Chakraborty here is trying to say is very important, meaning that subalternity functions through maintenance, continuance of a master serf relationship, master servant relationship. So, it demands a kind of patriarchal benevolence, a charitable behavior on the part of the master, although the larger hegemonic structure is not really topsy-turvied or tampered. So, the subalternity, as Chakraborty understands, is the composite culture of resistance to and acceptance of dominance and hierarchy. It is not really always looking to upturn the present situation of, or the current situation of domination. Sumit Sarkar further notes how subalternity functions within a through assertion within deference, meaning the way in which the subordinate, through evoking notions of benevolent patriarchy, is able to exploit his own subordination to his own benefit by contributing towards the definition of what constitutes the correct understanding of the patron's role. So, there is a kind of status quo that the subaltern also subscribes to and believes in. He does not necessarily want to become the master and make the master a slave or a serf overnight. That is not true, like Chakraborty and Sarkar would say. They would like to function within the structure of domination and yet expect a certain expect certain conditions to inform their own subordination, and within that subordination their welfare, within their state of subordination their welfare and the right behavior of the master and the patron's role are all protected and they are not violated in a way. So, there are certain boundaries that even subalterns want to maintain, they want to maintain and not overstep. So, subaltern's notion of what is fair, just or customary would refer backwards to the hierarchically structured order of an ideal society, thus contesting hierarchy and yet taking place within the hegemony of hierarchy. So, a respect of boss in the pre-capitalist culture, like Dipesh Chakraborty notes, is greatly shaped by, it churns out of religious, communal, kinship, linguistic and other similar loyalties. So, so there are critics that note that Chakraborty's understanding of this monolithic nature of class solidarity assumes culture as static and immutable. So, we could see, I mean critics would note that there could be critics note that there could be contradictions in the educated leaders culture. So, there could be leaders or masters that are willing to educate the laborers at their own expenses through through expending their own money. So, there could be contradictory pictures of the educated leader who is investing towards education of the laborers and yet on the other hand maintaining an unconscious sense of distance and supremacy. So, resistance as well as domination in their toned down figuration are mechanically applied, and they acquire an ever present quality which hardly comments or even renders visibility to the master-servant relationship. Now, George Lipsitz notes that the different forms of cultural expressions of different subcultural groups have a profound impact on mainstream popular culture. So, Lipsitz is against bemoaning the loss or the death of the folk cultural traditions, and instead want to see how these folk cultures have enormous, through their evolution, the way they have evolved and manifested themselves through ramified meanings, how they can actually pose their presence onto the marginal cultures and their functionings beyond the. So, we need to understand the folklore beyond the confined or specific definition of subculture, and this has a postmodernist undertone where there is rejection of distinction, clear distinction between high and popular culture, and this is also quite deconstructionist in a way, where we say in a Derridian sense that the center is constantly moving towards the margin and the margin is constantly moving towards the center. So, Jim Collins notes that demonizing mass culture through ascribing a kind of blanket definition or attaching certain blanket values can hardly be Bakhtinian. It rather reflects Frankfurt School's fundamentalism. So, a traditional mass culture critic does not consider that at its best popular culture retains memories of the past and contains hopes for the future that rebuke the injustices and inequalities of the present. Chantal Mouffe states that the problem is with the very idea of the unitary subject. So, we are always multiple and contradictory subjects, and we inhabit as diverse communities. We are constructed by variety of discourses, and precariously and temporarily we are these different communities and the subject formation in fact is centered at the intersection of those subject positions, and this also harkens back what Lawrence Grossberg has to say regarding our daily life being a site of struggle against hierarchically organized modes of modern cultural power rather than a utopic land of political redemption. So, when we talk of micro society, micro level meanings, power sets of complex and contradictory practices, and this is something the meanings that are constantly reshaping, protean meanings in flux that describe human relations in a subculture. Alok Bhalla notes that during the partition period there were countless attempts by fallible, in fact ordinary human beings to remain civil, to maintain the civil code of conduct, and that was even maintaining such conduct was heroic given the situation. So, he gives the details of ordinariness that that in many cases outlast the gory in that outlast the gory in many cases. So, details are important. Their ordinariness is necessary both as evidence and as boundaries against the phantasmagoric. So, for without being sure that my memory is located in the real world, I cannot hope to make an ethical inquiry into the history of my age and place. So, we need to record the different stories about events and people that also celebrate pity, thoughtfulness against the celebratory national victories or chronicles of community suffering. So, we have writings by Krishna Sobti, Rahi Masum Riza, Intizar Hussain, Mohan Rakesh, Kuratullah Haidar and so forth. So, in Adha Gaon, Reza talks about the tales of in Adha Gaon, the tales of riots were concluded and the stories of life began. These are the stories that actually never end. So, account of victory or I mean between account of victory and nightmares, there were so many grey existences that were neither completely black nor white, constructed in the form of compelling narratives. So, we see that these accounts of victory or nightmares try to form compelling narratives, and there are metaphysical imaginings of or identities of different communities where individuals actually become symbols, stock symbols of the stereotypical understanding of a community, nothing more than that. So, the characters in these accounts of victories or accounts of fall, nightmare, failure do not have any excesses, no emotional, physical or other excesses, because they subscribe to certain metaphysical identity. So, the fact of the partition permits the mainstream narrative to arrange this the diverse events in such a way into a successive and logical order. So, they always tend to lead to an expected end. So, some of the common tropes are fissured in the old relation between the communities. So, and then supporters of two nation theory talk about apprehensions among Muslims about Hindu domination, and conversely Hindus talk about British and Muslim collusion and Muslim treachery. So, these are narratives that keep coming back, and they are backed by official records such as police records, government files, newspapers, memoirs, reports, letters, public speeches and so forth. So, novelist in this or the artist has to take the stand for the sufferer, bear the witness, offer solace, rememorialize the nostalgic communities, and at many times speak with bitter ironies about possibilities of life, the different possibilities. So, historians' narratives actually move with a certitude towards a definite end, whereas the fictional accounts contain all that is locally contingent and truthfully remembered, capricious and anecdotal, contradictory and mythically given. So, where the ends could actually vary, and these are ways of marking out the emotional and ethical maps and emotional and ethical maps. So, through deploying mockery, anger, dark humor or even crumbling into silence. So, whether redemptive or pessimistic, pre-partition India should be I mean understood as a tolerant community, and so a sense of relatedness between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, not merely as passive acceptance of different customs and beliefs is necessary. So, the fictional and historical texts do not define the metaphysical identity of the different groups. So, taking into account the silent voices, the entire partition discourse could have a more motleyed and I mean a more heterogeneous heteroglossic appearance, where we see that human beings of different types, basically coming from different moral, different religious ecosystems, can actually coexist, and there is no claim of utopia that is outside of suspicion and squabbles. Society as a whole could contain such tension. According to partition artworks, these tensions, small squabbles or minor local tensions did not did not actually bring about partition. So, experience of life we see the experience of life sufficiently rooted and secured in the partition literary works and artworks that delve into the sufferings and the understandings of the individual. Thank you. I will meet you again for another round of discussions and lectures.